The strip at Demyansk was rolled snow. Not concrete, not steel planking. Rolled snow, packed flat by working parties dragging weighted logs behind a tractor, and then dragged again every time the wind moved it. It sat in open ground in the Valdai hills. The men who kept it clear worked in air that fell to minus 40 degrees Celsius, with snow lying 3 feet deep on either side of the rolled surface. A Junkers Ju 52 comes in low from the west. It has crossed Soviet-held ground at a couple of hundred feet, because at a couple of hundred feet a fighter has trouble picking you out against the tree line. The wheels go down on packed snow, the aircraft runs out, swings at the far end, and stops. Inside are about 2 tons of freight, rifle ammunition, artillery rounds, hard bread, fuel in drums, mail. 2 tons is not an abstraction. A man holding a position in that winter ate, fired, and burned through roughly 3 kilograms of material a day. So those 2 tons keep about 660 men alive and shooting for 24 hours. There are 100,000 men inside the ring. The ground party has the load off in minutes because a stationary transport on a marked strip is an artillery target. Nobody uses a forklift. Crates come out on shoulders and go onto sledges, and the sledges go into the tracks that pass for roads out to the divisions. At the edge of the field, the wounded are already waiting, laid out under whatever came to hand, sorted by whether they can sit up. A dozen or so go aboard for the return leg. Men who cannot sit up will wait for the next aircraft, and some of them wait for several days. The engines never stop turning. Shutting down a cold, soaked radial in that temperature means an hour of work to get it lit again, and an hour is not available. The aircraft turns into the wind and lifts away, and the next one is already on final approach. There was a second strip at Pesky, inside the same pocket, doing the same work. Do that about 15,000 times between February and May, and you have the Demyansk airlift, which is how it entered the German record, as the first time a force of that size had been kept fed, armed, and fighting entirely from the air while completely surrounded. 9 months later, in a house in Bavaria and a headquarters in East Prussia, that rolled snow strip stopped being a piece of field engineering and became an argument. The argument was built out of numbers, and the numbers, as far as the record shows, were never actually divided by anybody who had the authority to stop what happened next. The winter of 1941 to 1942 had gone badly for Army Group North. The German position around Demyansk was already a problem before anybody encircled anything. In the autumn of 1941, 16th Army had pushed east into the Valdai Hills, between Lake Ilmen and Lake Seliger, and had stopped there with a bulge sticking out into Soviet-held ground. It was held because it sat on the high watershed east of the Lovat, and because giving ground was not a thing the German command did that winter. The Soviet counteroffensive that opened in front of Moscow in December widened along the whole front. On the 7th of January, 1942, the Northwestern Front, under Lieutenant General Pavel Kurochkin, attacked into that bulge and around both sides of it. Kurochkin's object was not local. He was to cut off the German forces standing around Demyansk, then push west and northwest through Staraya Russa to unhinge the entire German position south of Leningrad. Army Group North was commanded by Generaloberst Georg von Kuchler. The formation directly in the path was 16th Army, under Generaloberst Ernst Busch. Against it, Kurochkin committed 1st Shock Army, 11th Army, 34th Army, 3rd Shock Army, and 53rd Army, with 1st and 2nd Guards Rifle Corps under command, something on the order of 400,000 troops across the whole operation. The southern arm of that attack reached furthest first. On the 21st of January, 1942, it cut off the road junction town of Kolm, about 100 kilometers southwest of Demyansk. Inside were around 5,500 men under General Major Theodor Scherer, commanding the 281st Security Division. The garrison was a scratch collection, elements of the 218th Infantry Division, an infantry regiment from the 329th, a reserve police battalion of the Ordnungspolizei, Luftwaffe ground personnel, and a hunting detachment. Kolm had no airfield and no ground on which to build one. 2.5 weeks later, the larger ring closed. On the 8th of February 1942, the Soviet spearheads met near Ramushevo on the Lovat River. Inside were 6 divisions, the 12th, 30th, 32nd, 123rd, and 290th Infantry Divisions, and the SS Division Totenkopf. Command of everything in the pocket went to 2nd Army Corps headquarters under General der Infanterie Walter Graf von Brockdorff-Ahlefeldt. The Totenkopf Division had been raised from concentration camp guard formations and was commanded by SS Obergruppenführer Theodor Eicke, who had held the post of inspector of the concentration camps before the war. That is, order of battle, and it belongs in the order of battle. The pocket enclosed roughly 1,865 square miles, between 30 and 45 miles across, with a perimeter of about 186 miles. Marsh, forest, frozen lake, and a road network that amounted to a set of tracks. It contained 2 usable airstrips and a supply dump that had been sized for a corps sitting on a working railhead. So by the second week of February, the German command in the north had 2 encircled forces and one decision to make about both of them: pull back to the Lovet and give up the Valdai, or stand where they were and be supplied from the air. Hitler ordered them to stand. Robert Citino, in Death of the Wehrmacht, places that order inside the sequence of winter-holding decisions that the German command came out of, convinced that standing fast worked. It is worth being precise about what the order actually committed the Luftwaffe to do, because the commitment was quantified from the first week. Luftflotte One, under Generaloberst Alfred Keller, was made responsible for keeping Demyansk alive. The officer given the transport force was Oberst Fritz Morsig, appointed Air Transport Commander East. Morsig had nothing standing by. Germany had no strategic air transport organization in 1942, only special-purpose bomber groups equipped with Junkers transports and scattered across the theaters. They were pulled in from across Europe. Where there were not enough operational units, the Luftwaffe went into its own flying schools and took the aircraft and the instructor crews out of the training establishment and sent them east. Heinkel. 111 bomber units were drawn in to fly freight as well, which meant they were not bombing anything while they did it. Joel Hayward, in Stopped at Stalingrad, sets the requirement plainly. The pocket needed a minimum of 300 tons of supply a day, and to sustain that, the Luftwaffe had to commit somewhere approaching 500 Junkers transports in order to keep about 150 of them flying on any given day. Divide those two figures into each other, and you get the whole operation in one line. 300 tons across 150 aircraft is 2 tons an aircraft, and 2 tons is exactly what a Junkers Ju-52 carried. The arithmetic closes. It is a clean, simple, checkable model, and it is the model the Luftwaffe General Staff carried in its head for the next 9 months. Here is the claim I want to test against the documents, and I want to put it at the front. The accepted account says Demyansk worked and Stalingrad did not, and that the difference was scale, weather, and Soviet air strength. All 3 of those are true, and none of them is the interesting part. I think the record shows something more specific and more damaging. Demyansk did not meet its own stated requirement either. Measured across the encirclement, the airlift ran below the 300-ton minimum that had been set for it, and the men inside were saved in the end by a ground corridor forced open in the 10th week. What the Luftwaffe General Staff took from Demyansk in November 1942 was not a delivery record. It was the memory of an outcome. The returns say something different, and there was a second case sitting right next to it, which nobody appears to have looked at. Kolm had no runway. Everything Scherer's garrison received had to come down by parachute canister or in the belly of a glider, the DFS 230 and later the Gotha 242, or in a Junkers put down deliberately on unprepared ground and written off where it stopped. Canisters that missed the perimeter went to the besiegers. A glider that came in under fire was a one-way delivery and its crew joined the garrison. Nothing came out. The wounded stayed. That is what air supply looks like when you cannot land and take off again. It is the harder problem, and it is the problem that 6th Army would actually face in January 1943, once the airfields inside its own pocket were gone. The Kolm case was available in 1942. It was decorated, written up, and celebrated. On the evidence of what the Luftwaffe staff said in November, it was not studied. The first phase of the Demyansk airlift ran from the closing of the ring on the 8th of February. It began badly. The bases outside the pocket were not equipped for the traffic. The weather in that latitude closed the fields for days at a time, and the crews arriving from the training schools had never flown a supply mission into a contested pocket in their lives. Loading was done by hand in the open. In the first fortnight, the operation lost more aircraft to weather, ice, and landing accidents than to enemy action, and the daily tonnage swung wildly from nothing at all on the closed days to a surge when the sky cleared. What the operation had going for it was the one thing that never appears in the celebratory accounts. There was almost no Soviet air force over the Valdai. Hayward is specific about this. Soviet air strength in the northwestern sector in early 1942 was negligible, and the German transports flew an almost uninterrupted shuttle at low loss rates. The Soviet air arm did contest it, and it paid for the attempt. Across the fighting for the pocket, the Northwestern Front's air units lost 408 aircraft, most of them fighters. But it was never in a position to close the corridor in the sky, And that is the single condition on which the entire Demyansk precedent rests. The flight itself was short. The bases outside the ring were close enough that a crew could turn around and go back in the same day, more than once, which is the difference between a shuttle and an expedition. Set the aircraft written off across the whole encirclement against the number of supply sorties flown, and the rate comes out at under 2 aircraft lost for every 100 sorties. A fleet can absorb that indefinitely. It can replace it out of production and keep the shuttle turning, which is what makes an operation like this repeatable rather than exceptional. The rate was that low because the opposition was thin, the flight was short, and the aircraft could be turned around on a prepared surface at both ends. Change any one of those 3 conditions, and the model changes with it. In November 1942, all 3 of them changed at once. Inside the ring, Brockdorff-Ahlefeldt organized the pocket around the 2 strips. Demyansk itself and Pesky. Both were surfaced with rolled snow. Both had to be cleared continuously by men who had no mechanical plant, and both came under artillery observation as the Soviet attacks pressed in. Around them, the divisions dug in on a perimeter of nearly 200 miles, which works out at roughly 1 man of the encircled force for every 10 feet of front before you subtract everybody who was not an infantryman. The line was not a line. It was a chain of fortified villages and forest camps with gaps between them that were covered by patrols and by the fact that the ground in between was impassable. The second phase, through March, was the airlift at full stretch, and it is the phase that earned the operation its reputation. The tonnage climbed, wounded came out, replacements went in, and the pocket held its perimeter through a Soviet effort that ran attack after attack against the western face, closest to the German lines, and against the 2 airfields. The Soviet command understood exactly what the strips meant. The German command understood exactly what the strips meant. Everything in February and March turned on that ground, and the divisions holding it were fed by the aircraft using it, which is a circular dependency that only holds as long as nothing breaks. The tonnage that arrived was also a standing argument inside the pocket, because it had to be split. Ammunition and food compete for the same 2 tons, and a corps under attack burns ammunition faster than it burns rations. Every day that the perimeter was pressed hard was a day the artillery allocation went up and the ration allocation came down, which is why an airlift that is technically delivering can still be starving the force it supplies. That relationship holds at any scale, and it is the mechanism by which a shortfall of 20% turns into a corps on half rations. The Totenkopf division took the worst of the perimeter fighting and was ground down to the point where it was withdrawn from Russia altogether in October 1942 to France, to be rebuilt from the bottom as a Panzer Grenadier formation. By the middle of March, the German command had already reached a conclusion that tends to get left out of the summary. Air supply was not going to be the solution. It was going to be the holding action while something else was arranged. 16th Army began assembling a relief force outside the ring, and the plan for that relief force is the part of Demyansk that actually decided the outcome. Quick note before the next part. 824 licensed photographs went into the book our team put together. 50 German commanders, admirals, and airmen, every entry the same, final rank, commands, operations, decorations, fate, then what the record holds against what was claimed. 746 of those photographs run again in a separate color volume, restored and upscaled. GermanCommand.com, and check for yourself. The relief operation was called Brückenschlag, which translates as the throwing of a bridge. It opened on the 21st of March 1942, out of the Staraya Russa area, with a force of 5 divisions under General Lieutenant Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach. Hold that name. It comes back. Brückenschlag was an infantry attack across ground that was in the process of thawing. The Valdai in late March turns from frozen swamp into liquid swamp, and it does so from the top down, so that a crust of ice sits on water sitting on mud. Vehicles could not leave the few causeways, which meant the attack had no armored weight to speak of, and no way to shift its axis once it committed. The advance went at the pace of men wading into prepared Soviet positions on a single narrow line because there was no other line available. It took a month to cover the distance. On the 14th of April, with Seydlitz's force still short of the Lovat, a matching attack was launched westward out of the pocket to meet it, which required the encircled corps to strip its own perimeter to find the troops. On the 21st of April, 1942, the 2 forces made contact at the river near Ramushevo. 10 weeks and 2 days after the ring closed, there was a land route into Demyansk again. It cost 3,335 German dead and more than 10,000 wounded to open it, and what it opened was not a front. It was a lane about 6 kilometers wide with Soviet artillery observation on both sides of it along its entire length. German troops who used it called it the Ramoshevo Corridor. Soviet accounts call it the Corridor of Death. Both descriptions are of the same stretch of road, and for months afterwards, moving down it in daylight was not a routine administrative act. Full ground supply into the salient did not resume until the 18th of May, 1942. That is the date the airlift's own accounting runs to. Calm ended 2 weeks earlier. The relief column reached Scherer's garrison on the 5th of May, 1942, after 105 days of encirclement. The garrison that was relieved numbered around 1,200 effective men out of the number that had been sealed in. What had kept them going was canisters, gliders, and written-off aircraft, and the sheer oddity of what could be pushed through that pipe. 35 examples of a brand new automatic carbine, the weapon that became the assault rifle, went into Cologne by air for troop trials. Because a garrison in close quarter fighting every day of the week was an obvious place to prove a new infantry weapon. Scherer had been awarded the Knight's Cross in February. He received the oak leaves on the day the siege was lifted. The Demyansk salient did not go away in May 1942. It stayed, a bulge hanging off the German line, held by a corridor too narrow and too exposed to serve as a proper supply artery. Air transport kept running into the salient at reduced intensity for the rest of the year, because the road alone could not carry the load, and every ton flown in after the 18th of May went into a set of books that later got added to the encirclement total. Through the rest of 1942, the Northwestern Front came back at that corridor in May, in July, and in the autumn, trying to pinch it shut at Ramoshevo and restore the ring. It never quite managed it, and the cost of not managing it was carried on both sides of a 6-kilometer lane for 10 months. The German formations in the salient spent that year holding ground that produced nothing, tied to a supply route that could be interdicted by field artillery, and 16th Army spent it feeding them. The salient was finally given up between the 20th of February and the 18th of March, 1943, after Hitler agreed to the withdrawal at the end of January. Everything the German army had spent a winter and 3,000 dead holding on to in 1942 was evacuated in 4 weeks, with no serious dispute about the operational necessity, once Stalingrad had happened. The Valdai position that had been worth an airlift, a relief offensive, and a year of attrition was given up in a month because the strategic argument for keeping it had died in a different pocket 1,000 kilometers to the south. There is one more piece of paper from Demyansk, and I think it is the most revealing document the whole affair produced. It is not a war diary, it is an award regulation. The Demyansk shield was instituted on the 25th of April 1943, a campaign shield worn on the upper left sleeve. Around 100,000 men qualified for it. The regulation defined the qualifying period as the 8th of February to the 21st of April 1942, and required 60 days of honorable service inside the besieged area, or less if you were wounded. I read those 2 dates again. The 8th of February is the day the ring closed. The 21st of April is the day Seydlitz reached the Lovat. The German Army's own decoration paperwork defines the Demyansk operation as a siege that ended when a ground relief force arrived. It does not date the event to the end of the airlift, on the 18th of May. It dates it to the link-up, nearly 4 weeks earlier. Whoever drafted that regulation understood perfectly well what had ended the encirclement of 2nd Army Corps, and it was not the transport fleet. The Cholm Shield had come first, instituted on the 1st of July 1942, with a qualifying period of the 21st of January to the 5th of May. About 5,500 men received it, which makes it the rarest of the German campaign shields. Same logic. The award is dated to the relief. Now to what happened with all of this in November. On the 19th of November 1942, the Red Army opened Operation Uranus, north and south of Stalingrad, against the Romanian armies holding 6th Army's flanks. On the 23rd, the pincers met at Kalash on the Don. Inside the ring was 6th Army, under General der Panzertruppe Friedrich Paulus, together with parts of 4th Panzer Army and Romanian formations, somewhere between 250,000 and 300,000 men. Demyansk is in the decision from the first hour. On the 20th of November, at the Berghof, Hitler put the question of air supply to General Oberst Hans Jaschonek, chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff. Hayward's account, drawing on the German records, has Jaschonek assuring Hitler that with adequate airfields, and with bombers flying freight alongside the transport groups, the Luftwaffe could lift what was needed. He invoked Demyansk directly. The Air Force had sustained 100,000 men in a pocket the previous winter for months on end. This was the same problem, larger. It was not the same problem, and the difference is arithmetic that a staff officer could have done on one sheet of paper. Take the ration the German army itself had used to size Demyansk. 300 tons for that many men works out at 3 kilograms per man per day. Apply that to the number of men in the Stalingrad pocket, and you get 750 tons a day at the low end of the encirclement estimate, and more at the high end. 6th Army's own supply staff produced exactly that figure, 750 tons. Paulus then cut it to the bone, stripping out everything except ammunition, fuel, and food, and arrived at 500 tons a day as an absolute floor below which the Army could not fight. 500 tons at 2 tons an aircraft load is 250 successful landings a day, every day. In winter, on the open Don steppe, into a single properly equipped airfield, across airspace held in strength by a Soviet Air Force that, in the Northwest, a year earlier had barely existed. The aircraft did not exist either. In November 1942, the Junkers transport fleet numbered around 750 airframes, and roughly a third of them were committed to the Mediterranean, flying into Tunisia after the Allied landings in northwest Africa on the 8th of November. That commitment was 2 weeks old when Uranus began. General Lieutenant Martin Fiebig, commanding 8th Air Corps, said so out loud on the 21st of November, telling 6th Army's Chief of Staff that supplying an entire army by air was impossible, and giving the North African commitment as one of his reasons. Jashonik's calculation also contained a technical error he did not catch until afterwards. Hayward's account has him going back to his staff, recalculating, and discovering that his figures had rested on wrong assumptions about how much a supply container actually held. The number he had given Hitler was not achievable with the equipment the Luftwaffe owned. There was one more condition that made Stalingrad the harder case, and it had nothing to do with aircraft. 6th Army had sent a large part of its horse transport back west before the encirclement to winter quarters where there was fodder, on the reasonable assumption that it was going into a static winter and would not need it. When the ring closed, the army inside had lost much of its capacity to move anything from an airfield to a division. Freight that landed at Potomnik still had to travel, on ground with no fuel to spare, and the fuel that would have moved it was itself part of the tonnage that was not arriving. Antony Beaver follows the ration scale down from there. By the end of December, the bread ration inside the pocket was about 200 grams a day, and in January it halved again. Here are the 2 sets of returns, side by side. Demyansk. The airlift ran from the 8th of February to the 18th of May, 1942. Fritz Morzik's post-war study for the United States Air Force, German Air Force airlift operations gives the totals that Robert Forzik reproduces in Demyansk, 1942 to 43. 14,455 transport sorties, 24,303 tons of supplies delivered, 15,446 replacements flown in, 22,093 wounded flown out. Divide that tonnage by the days it took, 100 of them, and it comes out at 243 tons a day, against a stated requirement of 300. Demyansk never met its own minimum. It ran at about 4/5 of it for 100 days, and the men inside were on reduced rations for the whole of that time. Luftwaffe losses at Demyansk, from Christer Bergstrom's work on the air war in the east, were 265 aircraft, including 106 Junkers Ju-52s, 17 Heinkel He-111s, and 2 Junkers Ju-86s, with 387 aircrew killed. Stalingrad. The airlift ran from the 24th of November 1942 to the beginning of February 1943, 71 days. Total delivered, 8,350 tons. Divided out, and that is about 117 tons a day against a floor of 500. Antony Beaver, in Stalingrad, puts the daily average lower still at about 105 tons, and the gap between those two figures is a question of which days you count. The best single day of the entire operation was the 7th of December 1942 at 362.6 tons, which is short of the requirement Demyansk had been given, for a force 2.5 times the size. Around 24,900 wounded and sick were flown out before the airfields went. The Luftwaffe wrote off 488 transport and bomber aircraft doing it. 266 Junkers Ju-52s, 165 Heinkel He-111s, 42 Junkers Ju-86s, 9 Focke-Wulf 200 Condors, 5 Heinkel 177s, and 1 Junkers Ju-290. Broken down the other way, the same total comes out as 166 destroyed, 108 missing, and 214 damaged beyond repair. Over 1,000 aircrew were killed. The Junkers element alone was more than a third of the entire German transport fleet. 91,000 men went into Soviet captivity at the end. About 6,000 of them came home. I want to walk through the 5 days in November in order, because the sequence is the argument, and because the most quoted scene in the whole literature turns out to sit in the wrong place in it. The 20th of November, Jeschonnek at the Berghof, giving Hitler the assurance described a moment ago. That is the first commitment, and it is made by the Luftwaffe's own Chief of Staff, unprompted by Göring, on the strength of the Demyansk analogy. The 21st of November, General Oberst Wolfram Freiherr von Richthofen, commanding Luftflotte 4, and therefore the officer who would have to run the operation, records in his diary that he is making every effort to convince his superiors that it cannot be accomplished, because the necessary transport resources are not available. He telephones Göring. He telephones Zeitzler. He telephones Jeschonnek. He telephones General Oberst Maximilian von Weichs at Army Group B. Hayward's account of the diary has him on the telephone until late into the night, and it has him asking to be put through to Hitler and being refused by everyone he asks. The same day, Fiebig telephones General Major Arthur Schmidt, 6th Army's Chief of Staff, with Paulus in the room. Fiebig's own report of the call has him stating that supplying an entire army by air is impossible. Schmidt's answer is that supply will have to come by air regardless. Fiebig telephoned again the following morning to repeat the point. The 22nd of November, Göring, at Berchtesgaden, is asked directly by Hitler whether the airlift can be done. He answers that, yes, it can be done. On the same day, at Nizhny-Cherskaya, General Major Wolfgang Pickert, commanding 9th Flak Division and about to be inside the pocket himself, tells Paulus and Schmidt that he would gather every formation he could and break out to the southwest. Schmidt tells him it simply has to be done, and adds that the men inside can cut the supply requirement by eating the horses. The 23rd of November, Paulus signals that timely and adequate supply has been ruled out, and asks for freedom of decision. Hitler's mind is already fixed. Zeitzler's account has Hitler saying that 6th Army will stay where it is, that it is the garrison of a fortress, and that if necessary, it will hold out through the winter. The 24th of November in the early hours, Hitler issues the formal order designating the position Fortress Stalingrad and directing that it be held. The order contains the line that air supply by 100 more Junkers is getting underway. The 25th of November, Richthofen's diary again. Everything available is being flown in, and there are 30 Junkers on hand. The delivery that day is 75 tons against the 300 ordered. Now the scene everybody knows. The confrontation in which General der Infantry Kurt Zeitzler produces the army staff calculations, listens to Göring guarantee the tonnage, and tells Hitler to his face that the Reichsmarschall is lying, is real. It is in the literature, and it is in Zeitzler's own post-war account. And Hitler's reply is that Göring has made his report, and that he has no choice but to believe it. That exchange is almost always presented as the moment the fate of 6th Army was sealed. It cannot be. Göring left for Paris after the 22nd and spent 4 days there in the art dealers and the galleries. He returned on the 27th of November. Hayward makes the point directly and stopped at Stalingrad, and I think it is the most useful correction in the historiography of the airlift. The Zeitzler confrontation happened on the 27th at the earliest, 3 days after Hitler had already signed the fortress order. It did not cause the decision. It came after it, which means the decision was not carried by Göring's promise at all. It was carried on the 20th of November by a Luftwaffe General Staff officer, citing a precedent from the previous winter. Jeschonnek did go back and check, and having found his own error, he asked Göring to take the correction to Hitler. Göring declined to carry it. Jeschonnek shot himself on the 18th of August, 1943. The rest of it followed the arithmetic. Manstein's relief attack, Winter Storm, opened on the 12th of December 1942 with 57th Panzer Corps and 3 Panzer divisions under 4th Panzer Army, and got to within about 30 miles of the perimeter before it was stopped, with the Soviet offensive against the Italian 8th Army on the 16th of December, pulling away everything that might have reinforced it. That is the Brückenschlag equivalent, and it did not arrive. The Demyansk model had a second half that Stalingrad never executed either. At Demyansk, the relief did not simply drive in from outside. The encircled corps stripped its own perimeter and attacked outward to meet it, and the two halves closed the gap between them. The equivalent at Stalingrad had a code name, Thunderclap, and it required 6th Army to come out southwest to meet 4th Panzer Army, which in turn required abandoning Stalingrad. Hitler would not release the city. Paulus reported that his fuel state would not carry the army much more than 20 miles in any case, which is his figure and rests on his own returns. And by the time the argument was settled, the relief force had been pushed back beyond the distance in question. The one maneuver that had actually saved a pocket in 1942 was the one maneuver nobody performed in 1943. The airfields went next. Tetsinskaya, the principal departure base, was overrun on the 24th of December 1942 by the 24th Tank Corps under Major General Vasily Badanov, which caught roughly 170 operational transports on the ground. About 100 of them got away. By German count, some 72 aircraft were destroyed there, close to a tenth of the Luftwaffe's entire transport capacity in one morning. Inside the ring, Pitomnik fell on the 17th of January 1943, and Gumrak on the 23rd. General Feldmarschall Erhard Milch had arrived in the middle of January with a special commission from Hitler to fix the airlift, and he arrived to find that the thing he had been sent to fix no longer had anywhere to land. From that point on, Stalingrad was the calm problem. Canisters dropped to men who could send nothing back, and the wounded stayed where they were. The end of it ran to a short calendar. On the 8th of January 1943, a Soviet parliamentary party came through the lines with surrender terms for Paulus, who refused them on Hitler's instruction. On the 10th, the Don Front, under Lieutenant General Konstantin Rokossovsky, opened Operation Ring against the pocket. On the 26th, the pocket was cut in two in the middle of the city. On the 30th of January, Hitler promoted Paulus to General Feldmarschall, an appointment made on the reasoning that no German officer of that rank had ever surrendered. Paulus surrendered the following day. The northern pocket, under General der Infanterie Karl Strecker, held out until the 2nd of February. So what does the comparison actually establish? First, that the German air transport arm was asked in November 1942 to repeat a performance it had not delivered the first time. Extrapolating from a baseline that was already 4/5 of its own target to a force 2.5 times larger in worse weather against a real air force with a third of the transport fleet already committed to Tunisia does not produce a difficult operation. It produces an impossible one, and the impossibility was arithmetically visible in May 1942 to anybody holding Morzik's returns. Second, the Demyansk tonnage has been inflated in circulation, and I think this is where a genuine research problem sits, rather than a moral one. A much larger figure appears in a great many accounts, on the order of 65,000 tons, with 32,427 supply sorties, 30,500 men flown in, and 35,400 flown out. That is not the same measurement. It covers the whole air transport effort in that sector, column included, running past the link-ups and on through the life of the salient into 1943. Set that number against a 71-day operation at Stalingrad and Demyansk, looks like an achievement of a completely different order. Set the 100-day figure against it, and the two are recognizably the same operation, one of which had a way out, and one of which did not. The published works do not always distinguish between the two accountings, and it is worth knowing which one you are being quoted before you use it in an argument. Third, and this is the one that gets missed, our best statistics for Demyansk come from a study written after the war for the United States Air Force by the officer who commanded the Demyansk airlift. Morzik's work is the foundation for almost everything published on the subject in English, and it is the same category of document as the rest of the American Historical Division output, produced by former German officers, writing about their own operations with the benefit of hindsight and an audience. That does not make the numbers wrong. It does mean the numbers are the airlift commander's own accounting of the airlift, and that no independent set has ever been placed alongside them. Fourth, the variable that decided both cases was not tonnage. It was whether an aircraft could land, unload, take on wounded, and take off again. Demyansk had 2 working strips inside the ring for the entire encirclement, and a shuttle short enough to fly twice in a day. 6th Army had 2 airfields for 8 weeks, and then none, with its outer bases going the same way, and once you cannot land, you're not running an airlift, you're running a supply drop, and a supply drop cannot evacuate anybody. Fifth, there is an institutional cost that appears in neither set of tonnage tables. Richard Muller, in the German Air War in Russia, follows what the transport commitment did to the German Air Force as a body. The training establishment was raided for Demyansk in 1942, and raided again far harder for Stalingrad, and the instructors killed flying freight were the men who would otherwise have been producing the next generation of aircrew. Horst Boog and his colleagues in the sixth volume of Germany in the Second World War set that inside the wider picture of a Luftwaffe committed on three fronts at once in the winter of 1942 and able to concentrate decisively on none of them. Sixth, the precedent did not stop at Stalingrad. What Demyansk and Kulm established inside the German command was not a transport capability. It was a category. A surrounded force could be designated, supplied, and eventually recovered, and therefore encirclement stopped being a reason to withdraw. That category outlived the operation that produced it, and it was written into standing orders. On the 8th of March, 1944, Führer Order No. 11 created the fortified places, towns, and road junctions designated to be held to the last when bypassed, each with a named commandant who signed for the responsibility personally. The reasoning in that order is the reasoning of February 1942, generalized and made permanent, and by then, the transport fleet that had made the original case possible had been written off twice over. And there is a case on the other side of this that deserves to be put at full strength rather than waved at. Erich von Manstein argued and lost victories that Sixth Army's continued resistance inside the pocket was operationally worth what it cost, because it held Soviet forces in front of Stalingrad through December and January, while Army Group A was extracted from the Caucasus, and the southern wing of the German front was reconstructed. That is his claim, made after the war by a man with an interest in how the winter of 1942 was understood, and it should be labeled as such. But it is not an empty claim, and the operational record supports part of it. Reducing the pocket took the Don Front 7 armies, and just over 3 weeks in January, and those armies were not available for anything else while they did it. David Glantz and Jonathan House, in Endgame at Stalingrad, follow that force commitment in detail. Where I think the argument fails is that it is a justification for the resistance, not for the airlift. Sixth Army could have fixed Soviet armies in place by fighting westward in a breakout, as well as by sitting still, and the decision taken in November was not a decision to trade an army for time. It was a decision taken on the stated understanding that the army would be supplied and held until it could be relieved. The tonnage figures are the test of that understanding, and they fail it inside the first week. And then there is the man who connects the two operations directly. Walther von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, who commanded the force that broke into Demyansk in April 1942, took over 51st Corps on the 8th of May 1942, and was inside the Stalingrad pocket from November. He argued there for a breakout, and then for capitulation against Hitler's standing order. On the 25th of January 1943, he told his division commanders that they were free to decide for themselves whether to surrender, and Paulus relieved him of his command that day. The officer who had proved from the outside that a pocket could be opened spent the last week of Stalingrad being overruled about it from the inside. Brockdorf Ahlefeldt did not see any of it. He fell ill in November 1942, went back to Germany, and died in a Berlin hospital on the 9th of May 1943. He had received the Oak Leaves to the Knight's Cross on the 27th of June 1942 as the 103rd recipient for holding the pocket. The record holds 2 operations conducted on the same principle 9 months apart. The first ran 100 days at 4/5 of its own stated ration, in unopposed air into 2 working strips, and was ended by 5 divisions walking through a swamp. The second ran 71 days at under a quarter of its floor in contested air into airfields that were lost one after another, and was ended by capitulation. Both were held on the same argument. Only one of them had a relief force that arrived. The German award regulation dates the first to the day the relief force got there. No campaign shield was ever instituted for the second. The Soviet cost of reducing the Demiansk position is in the Northwestern Front's own returns for January to May 1942, 88,908 killed and missing, and 156,603 wounded. German losses in 16th Army over the same period were 11,777 killed, 2,739 missing, and around 40,000 wounded. Those 2 sets of figures come from 2 different accounting systems that counted missing men and returned wounded differently, and the ratio between them is the reason the Demyansk fighting was written up in Germany as a defensive victory. The precedent itself is documented to the day. The 20th of November, 1942, the Berghof, one comparison drawn out loud between a pocket in the Valdai and 250,000 men on the Don. The 4 days that followed produced objections from the Air Fleet commander who would have to fly it, from the Air Corps commander whose crews would have to fly it, and from a flak division commander who was about to be inside the pocket, and none of those objections reached the man who signed the order. The order was signed on the 24th. The famous argument about whether it could be done was held on the 27th. If your father or grandfather flew transports in the East, or was on the receiving end of one of those drops, I would like to hear about it in the comments. That's what the record shows. The sources are in the description. I'll see you in the next one.